Dear Laureate, seminar speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good friends. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this Nils Klim seminar in honor of the 2022 Nils Klim Laureate, Elisa Uusimäki, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the Department of Theology, School of Culture and Society at Aarhus University in Denmark. My name is Kjersti Fløttum, and I'm the chair of the Holberg board, who annually awards the Nils Klim Prize to outstanding young scholars from the Nordic countries within the fields of the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. And today is a special and joyful day in many ways. In addition to the nice weather, of course, we are celebrating that we can meet physically at last after 2 years of a pandemic closed down. But we are also celebrating that today's seminar marks the opening of the traditional Holberg Week in Bergen, a week of celebrations and several academic events with the participation of outstanding scholars. We welcome everyone present here in the University Aula in Bergen, as well as all of you who are following the live stream from around the world. For the Nils Klim seminar, the laureate is asked to propose a topic, as well as the person with whom she would like to converse. And we look very much forward to taking part in the presentations and discussions during this year's Nils Klim seminar in honor of Elisa Uusimäki. Elisa has chosen the very interesting and relevant topic for her seminar, Historical Perspectives on Women's Mobility. And to present the laureate and the seminar speakers, we are very pleased and privileged to have with us Jorunn Økland. Jorunn is Professor of Interdisciplinary Gender Studies in the Humanities at the Center for Gender Research, and also professor at the Faculty of Theology, University of Oslo. And hereby, I give the floor to Professor Jorunn Økland, who will moderate the event. Please, Jorunn.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with you all. But most importantly, we are here because of Elisa Uusimäki, who has, or who will soon receive the Nils Klim Prize. Congratulations, first of all. And the Nils Klim Prize is a prize for younger researchers from or in the Nordic countries. And I quote from the announcement, the 2022 Nils Klim Prize is awarded to Finnish theologian Elisa Uusimäki for her outstanding research into the literary and cultural history of Judaism in Antiquity. Uusimäki is an exceptionally accomplished and productive scholar, and then you can continue to read the full statement from the committee on the Holberg Prisen web pages. From her CV, since 2020, Uusimäki was Associate Professor in Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, Department of Theology, School of Culture and Society, Aarhus University. Since 2021, she is also part of the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies. And in this context, she is the principal investigator of the European Research Council-funded project An Intersectional Analysis of Ancient Jewish Travel Narratives, which lasts until 2026. Before she came to Denmark, she did her BA, MA, and doctorate in theology at the University of Helsinki, where she earned the title of docent in 2017. This year, we can also congratulate her as Dr. Theol in the Danish system. As many biblical scholars, she has additional education in languages beyond the compulsory ones everyone has to study for a theology degree. And Uusimäki has extra studies in Hebrew and Arabic from Jerusalem and Helsinki. She has extensive international mobility, including research stays at Yale, Manchester, Groningen, Hebrew University Jerusalem, and École Biblique Jerusalem. Uusimäki mentions that her research interest is the literary and cultural history of Judaism in antiquity, broadly understood. Her key research areas include Hebrew Bible and early Jewish literature. Another key research area is wisdom literature and descriptive ethics, in which she compares wisdom and ethics across languages and cultures that otherwise divided ethnic groups living around the ancient Mediterranean. More generally, she is interested in lived ancient religion, cultural interaction, travel and mobility in the ancient world, gender and intersectionality, and early reception history of the Bible. This means how the early biblical writings were passed on, translated, and reinterpreted in the early centuries after their initial production. Her two published monographs are Turning Proverbs Towards the Torah, an analysis of 4Q 5-5. This is a Qumran text. And Lived Wisdom in Jewish Antiquity, Studies in Exercise and Exemplarity. And I would then like the panel, please, to come up here and take your seats. So, welcome everyone to this panel. I will first give a very, very brief introduction, and we will start very soon. So, the topic of the panel is historical perspectives on women's mobility. And we will explore aspects of women's travel in the ancient Mediterranean. And I quote, "How travel and movement was part of life in the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, currently receives increased focus across all disciplines working in the areas of Greco-Roman antiquity, but also in the ancient Near East, further back in time. Voluntary or forced migration, war, and the need to flee and seek refuge elsewhere are topics that have recently been highlighted. The topic of travel is also gaining momentum in Hebrew Bible studies, Uusimäki's home field. In this seminar, she will also address how scholarly attention is now increasingly given to social memories of the travel of individuals, families, or smaller groups, also in this textual corpus. But the main focus today will be on what enabled or compelled women to move in the past. Why has women's mobility tended to be more overlooked than men's mobility? This seminar explores aspects of women's voluntary or involuntary journeys from antiquity to the modern era. And with us, we have three experts in areas complementing Uusimäki's own, so we can look forward to a truly interdisciplinary conversation gathered around a common theme, female mobility in the ancient Mediterranean. I will just mention the speakers briefly. They will be introduced later, but they are Lynn Foubert, Women's Travelers in the Greco-Roman World, Jessica van Westende, Jewish and Christian Women on the Move in Late Antiquity, and Truls Miro Christensen, Traces of Women's Mobility in the Material Culture. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Elisa. And I will try to keep track on the time. But please.
Thank you very much for the kind introductions, Professors Fluttum and Ökland. Dear colleagues, dear members of the audience, let me begin by thanking for the opportunity to arrange this year's Nils Klim seminar, which explores historical perspectives on women's mobility with a focus on the ancient Mediterranean milieu. In Antiquity, just as today, mobility covered a range of short, medium, and long-distance movement in space, including random visits, short trips, and migrations. Questions of mobility, its limits, and societal conditions have recently occupied many of us, beginning with the reconsideration of our relation to travel owing to COVID-19. Yet the world continues to be filled with types of movement. People travel as commuters, businesswomen, soldiers, tourists, backpackers, exchange students, economic migrants, members of multicultural families, and refugees. While the list could go on, these examples reveal that mobility is rooted in diverse social realities, including both privileges and inequalities that condition related experiences. In this year, millions of Europeans have had to move after Russia's brutal and insane actions in Ukraine have disrupted and destroyed their lives, bringing questions of home, migration, and hospitality to the forefront of our daily discussions and actions. Mobility has received rapidly increasing interest across disciplines investigating the human past, including history, archaeology, classics, and the study of religion. These studies have reached from prehistory to antiquity and beyond, showing that people and objects have always been in motion. The remains of ancient cities, for one, point to generations of arrivals and returns. In fact, mobility is the first human condition. At the dawn of history, as Eric Lied writes, humans were migratory animals. Sessility, the condition of being attached to a single place, and the notion of a localizable home is a later development. It is thus illuminating to approach history from the viewpoint of motion. As for the ancient Mediterranean, various sources demonstrate that travel, while expensive and strenuous, was essential for slavery, warfare, diplomacy, administration, trade, building projects, and social life. This is suggested by texts narrating relocations of both individuals and groups, as well as by the scattering of material objects left by movers. Ecological conditions too suggest that owing to climate and geography, people in the region sometimes had to move to survive. The volume of travel increased in the last centuries before the Common Era. Long-distance trips had become relatively common by the Hellenistic period, and their scope grew in the Roman Empire, favored by the time's socio-political and cultural factors. The flows of people in the Mediterranean constituted migration streams tied to slavery, labor, military, and trade in particular. Mobility was neither a marginal phenomenon nor an exception to the normal state of affairs. The groundswell and context of ancient mobility intersect with questions of social stratification and power. People have always been on the move, but not with equal prospects or same intentions. Today, we specifically map out women's mobility. The topic pertains to my current research project, which analyzes literary and cultural representations of travel in ancient Jewish literature. One section of the project concerns women travelers, paying attention to a neglected aspect of mobility in the past. This aim is integral to our seminar as well. But why explore female mobility? In brief, the assumption that women barely moved in antiquity is not uncommon. Women have been understood as immobile, homebound figures, with the consequence that their role as traveling agents has been downplayed or ignored. The Greek multitasker Xenophon of Athens formulated this idea in his Oikonomicus. For Xenophon, the gender division between male movers and female stayers reflects a divine order. Yet ancient authors are not the only ones characterizing women as immobile. It has been argued that long-distance mobility in antiquity was a specialized activity to which only relatively few had access. The likely movers were male, typically slaves, soldiers, or traders with valuable skills. The greater part of women were born, lived, and died in the same community, and only some of them traveled in the company of their spouses. Likewise, studies on later eras have asked whether the practice of travel is a men's issue or travel a male concept, given that the history of travel in the Western tradition is largely a history of men such as Columbus or Captain Cook. Lead contrasts the masculine logic of mobility with the feminine logic of sessility, using the botanical image of being permanently planted. To be sessile means to remain home, a role typically assigned to women. This makes travel a gendering activity that defines masculinity in many cultures. Scholars working on travel literature have considered the same association between women and sedentary domestic life, arguing that travel literature largely counts as male literature. Ancient writings, for one, narrate fictive journeys of famous men such as Sinuhe, Gilgamesh, Abraham, Odysseus, or Aeneas. Since then, travel has served as a medium of male immortalities. It has enabled conquerors, crusaders, explorers, merchants, naturalists, anthropologists, and so forth to acquire transformational experiences. Meanwhile, a woman, beginning with Penelope, serves as the home symbolic embodiment, as pointed out by Karen Lawrence. Despite their association with home, women have always been on the move. The argument that most ancient women did not move far may be statistically correct, but generalizing claims are problematic and harmful. They simplify the evidence that speaks for women's remote travel in diverse socio-economic contexts. They narrow down research interests by signaling that the question of women's mobility is secondary to our understanding of the past. They also fail to consider the variety of movement. In addition to men's heroic trips, it encompasses a spectrum of voluntary and forced travel. Celebrity movers are one thing, and a few ancient women are remembered as such, but the complexity of travel in real life is another thing, and women's journeys are an excellent starting point for investigating it. We should thus ask who travels and why, analyzing historical, social, and cultural forces at stake. What is the role of various forms of social stratification? How does movement affect positions and self-understandings, including but not limited to familial roles, socio-economic statuses, or identifications with ethnic or religious groups? My own research investigates these questions in the context of Jewish antiquity. While scholars have often overlooked the Hebrew Bible and early Jewish writings as sources of mobility, a closer look at them indicates relocations owing to slavery, trade, warfare, famines, family life, pilgrimage, festivals, and education. Movement enables access to new resources and rewarding experiences, as well as causing uprooting and unwanted homelessness. While there is some earlier evidence for mobility, Jewish writings from the Hellenistic and Roman eras attest to a growing number of references to travel. This aligns with the period's generic developments, such as increased cultural interaction, better infrastructure, and the unification of the Mediterranean region under Roman rule. Diaspora settlements also caused permanent relocations, as well as temporary trips in Jewish communities. Certainly, many of the sources are not traditional archival sources, but fictive stories that do not provide us with access to specific events or figures. Yet fictive texts, too, are precious documents of cultural history. The authors drew in their own experiences and knowledge of the world. The sources thus reflect ancient ideas of and attitudes to travel. They echo aspects of social life in antiquity and assist us in imagining and reconstructing past lives. As for women's mobility, Jewish women lived in largely agrarian societies with urban political centers. Military and trade relations connected local lives with international networks. The sexual division of labor was distinct in that the public realm mainly belonged to men. Women's tasks in the private domain contributed to their lives' local character. Those from the society's upper strata had more leisure time, but issues of family honor limited their spatial freedom as well. Despite these impediments, the sources indicate several reasons for women to move. Their work as midwives required mobility, and girls had tasks such as drawing water from wells, herding sheep, or gathering woods. There is also evidence for major visits and relocations beyond movement necessitated by daily life. Let us begin with warfare, trade, and politics, since a great deal of long-distance mobility revolved around them. The ancient Jewish evidence for women's activity in these domains is limited. Yet there are exceptions, and men's travel in these spheres also affected women's lives. Military service constituted a major reason for men to move. There is some limited evidence for female leadership in situations of warfare, and women fought in the Jews' war against Rome. Yet it was more common that warfare forced women to leave their homes. The Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom of Israel and the Babylonian takeover of the southern kingdom of Judah caused forced migrations through which the empires sought to maintain their control over the conquered territories. While the accounts of these events pay little attention to women, they are present among the movers. Centuries later, we have evidence for women at Masada, the last Jewish holdout sieged by the Romans in the end of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. During the second revolt against Rome, some Jews, including women, hid in the canyon of Wadi Muraba'at. Military campaigns also involved forced displacement of female captives as sexual property and symbols of conquest. Legal material seeks to regulate the treatment of foreign captives, but the seeming concern deprecates the fact that the question is about sexual slavery and sanctioned rape in warfare. References to the displacement of women acquired during military campaigns further abound in biblical narratives. As for trade and political journeys, the sources do not mention remote journeys of Jewish businesswomen. Yet women contributed to the economic system as producers of exports and moved for business reasons, at least locally, as is shown by passing references in narratives and, later on, by the rabbinic discussion on restricting women's presence in the marketplace. Second, even if men undertook most political journeys, the fictive tale about the Queen of Sheba highlights the prospects of influential women in the management of foreign relations. Though the majority of those who made military, business, or political trips were men, long-distance travel was also rare to most men. Yet movement is not just about faraway journeys made for professional purposes. The lack of remote travel does not mean that ancient lives would have been immobile. Regional and local trips, too, are mobility. In fact, the gendered aspect seems rather different if we look beyond military, trade, and political mobility. All forms of travel that are relevant to traditional history writing, but leave out much of human experience. Forms of slavery caused much undesired movement. I have already mentioned the treatment of war captives as movable property and sexual slaves. Fictional narratives further draw attention to the sex trafficking of young girls and the vulnerability of slaves. The figure of Hagar, the Egyptian slave of Sarah and Abraham, is a wayfaring alien who is dependent on her master's goodwill and experiences both escape and expulsion. An anonymous woman known as the Levite's concubine, in turn, takes an initiative to move between her master's house and her childhood home, but has a tragic end when the men of the village, where she and her master stay on their way back home, rape and abuse her. While the impact of slavery on women's lives is drastic, free women depicted in the sources are far from a unified group, hailing from diverse contexts that both enable and force movement. Given that travel requires resources, one might expect the female movers to be very privileged. Yet the Jewish sources actually provide limited evidence for elite women's mobility. The Hebrew Bible mentions diplomatic marriages where rulers move princesses around as symbols of political alliance. Early Jewish writings further point to elite women's moves owing to leisure and learning. Philo of Alexandria condemns luxurious journeys, criticizing the upper class in Roman Alexandria. He also tells about Jewish women and men philosophers who withdraw from the buzz of Alexandria to the Mareotic Lake. However, a great deal of women's movement depicted in the sources concerns the society's middle strata. Marriage arrangements are a common reason for ordinary women's mobility. Biblical stories and late antique papyri from the Judean desert attest to brides' relocations. In biblical narratives, brides have to relocate because of their reproductive capital to continue the desired lineage. While women such as Rebecca are depicted as being willing to move, men strike the deals on their future. Interestingly, Rebecca moves with her maids. It alleviates her pain, but could be undesirable to those forced to move with her. In addition, the narrative stressed the value of proper farewell at departure, which should not be abrupt, but accompanied by music and kisses, or blessings and instruction. Women also take part in sacred travel. Those in reproductive age are associated with visits to sacred places in the hope of pregnancy, as in the case of Hannah, who travels to a regional shrine in Shiloh. Mostly, however, the trips head for Jerusalem, which was promoted as the central place of worship. While pilgrimage to Jerusalem is portrayed as a relatively widespread practice, biblical laws remain ambiguous regarding the wife's obligation to appear in the temple during the pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Instead, they exhort women to offer sacrifices in the temple after giving birth. Some women further brought sacrifices to the temple because of their Nazirite vows or to give thanks offerings. Environmental reasons further prompted economic migration. In Genesis' fictive tales about the distant past, the Hebrew patriarchs move around because of famines, including but not limited to the story about Sarai and Abram in Egypt, in which Sarai becomes a type of sex worker in the Pharaoh's court. In the short story about Ruth, the Moabite protagonist follows her mother-in-law to Bethlehem and ends up working in Boaz's fields as a foreign laborer exposed to gendered sexual violence. Strikingly, both women are told to commit sexual deeds with foreign men to secure the family finances in precarious situations. To conclude, ancient Jewish sources, for one, outline or imply copious women travelers. Many questions remain unanswered, but the sum of sporadic evidence results in a more nuanced notion of the past, regardless of how local and minor women's mobility may have been from the viewpoint of those in power. In Antiquity, forms of mobility were as complex as the society in general. Various social realities prompted, enabled, or compelled types of movement that intertwine with power or lack thereof. Class matters, but does not explain everything, as multiple factors, one's position in the patriarchal family, religious laws, oppressive ideologies, and interpersonal interactions influence movers' agency and experiences, for better or worse. Travel facilitates things, but also disrupts social ties and connotes dislocation. Instead of celebrity movers, the ancient accounts of women's journeys draw attention to travelers forgotten in traditional history writing. Paying attention to women helps us resist romantic readings of mobility, which tend to prioritize movement of the privileged cosmopolitans. It urges us to deconstruct modern Western ideas that associate travel with freedom and escape from necessity, at the expense of neglecting the phenomenon's great ambiguity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that mind-blowing opening. The next speaker is Jessica van Westeinde, who is a research fellow at the Department of Ancient History at the University of Bern and affiliated research fellow at the Department of Ancient History, University of Tübingen. She recently published her first monograph, Roman Nobility in Jerome's Letters, in 2021 with Moore Siebeck. Her research focuses mostly on Jerome, Jewish urban life in Antiquity, late Antiquity, and spatial agency in the ecumenical councils of the 5th century. One of the overarching themes in these research projects, or in this research project, is the question of mobility, migration, connectivity, and networks. Jessica has published several articles on travel and perception in the works of Polybius and Jerome. Most notably, she contributed to Elisa Uusimäki and Barry Hartog's special issue journal Views on the Mediterranean in the Journal for Theology and the Study of Religion in 2021, with an article on Jerome and Paula's journey to the Holy Land. So please, Jessica.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation and for arranging this gorgeous weather And of course, many congratulations to Elisa for this amazing achievement. I am not sure how well known the BBC series Gentleman Jack is here in Norway, but it presents a story of 19th century elite woman Anne Lister, based on her decoded diaries. Lister loves to travel, and she does not set out on one grand tour of Europe, but she tries to travel the continent as often as she can. Throughout the series, it is often brought up how she travels alone, which is unheard of, or with a companion. Traveling alone becomes evident, means not traveling with an equal, one of similar social standing. It is a given that she travels with footmen and maidservants. The image here on screen presents us with her new chambermaid, Eugenie, who, as it seems, does not travel well. It is a lovely image right after breakfast, I apologize, but it captures the essence of what I want to talk about today. Elite women, be it in the 19th century or in Antiquity, did travel voluntarily, but their servants were forced to accompany them. No questions asked. My talk today is an exercise in imagination, albeit not quite as explicit as a servant being sick. I will try to read between the lines of the narratives that deal with elite women traveling across the Roman Empire. Although they are often presented as the sole protagonists, they would not embark on solo travel like gap-year backpackers on their world tours today. In this paper, I wish to demonstrate how one could make visible these invisible servants and their possible experience of lived reality. First, I will illustrate the context by saying a few words on mobility of elite women. Then I like to present, a few general remarks on slave mobility in Antiquity, before I start with my case study, which is a close reading of a selection of Jerome's letters. Here, I wish to offer some thoughts about perception of servants and slave girls in general, and their forced mobility in particular. These examples will offer the possibility to hypothesize servant perspectives and experiences, rendering them visible and making them just a little less anonymous. Travel, mobility, and migration have been the subject of many studies, particularly in the past 2 decades. The gendered aspect of this, as Elisa has just shown in her introduction, has recently also come to the attention of scholars across different disciplines in the humanities, often prompted by methods and approaches developed in the social sciences. Although the evidence of women's mobility in antiquity is relatively scarce, particularly compared to men's traveling adventures, the resources and power available to elite women enabled them to undertake even long-distance journeys for leisure. It is actually this aspect of leisure that makes it so fascinating. It is a form of ancient tourism for the sole purpose of sightseeing out of curiosity, and through that, learning, expanding one's horizon, one's mind, as Line Foubert has demonstrated in her work. Whereas men could be expected to be traveling around for business-related matters, as we also just heard, trade, inspecting estates in the provinces, political embassies, military expeditions, these types of travel would not normally be undertaken by women, if at all. Furthermore, if one thinks of the costs and the dangers related to long-distance travel, this makes such voluntary journeys all the more remarkable. Unfortunately, literary evidence in the form of travel diaries and narratives written up by men about women are few and far between. Egeria, Paula, and Melania are among the happy few whose peregrinations have been preserved for posterity. In the case of Egeria, this might even be one of the only travel accounts written by a woman. Melania's journeys through the empire have been recorded by Palladius. Paula's journey to the Holy Land and her subsequent sightseeing tour have been written up by Jerome in his famous epitaph. One might argue that Paula and her daughter Eustochium wrote up a mini itinerary in their letter to Marcella in Rome, if one accepts that the latter is authored by them and not by Jerome himself. Jerome's account of the trip in Letter 108 reads as an extended edition of the one drawn up by Paula and Eustochium in Letter 46, which is dated to 386, some 20 years before Jerome's epitaph. Material evidence, as we will hear from Truls later, especially in the form of inscriptions and graffiti, offers some additional sources to gain more insight into women's travel behavior. Again, Lien Fuber has shown this in a study on migrant women in Egypt. Here are traces of women who left behind messages relating to their travel endeavors. However, these sources mostly and almost solely concern elite women. If traces of elite women are already scarce, how much more so for women of lower social status, especially servants or slaves? The elite women in the accounts that I mentioned had the means to set out on grand tours to expand their minds, as I show also in a piece on, related to travel and learning. But when these women would set out on their grand tours, they would not travel alone, as I said in my introduction. Even for trips or parades around town, they would have a cohort of servants that would accompany them. Yet, whereas local and short-distance travel, one may assume, would not have had a severe impact on the daily livelihood of servants, this would be different in case of long-distance travel or even immigration. Before I continue with my case study, I want to say a few words about slave mobility in late antiquity more general. Slave mobility may sound a bit as an apologetic or PC term for slave trade. Of course, slave trade, forced mobility, migration, or perhaps even better, displacement of humans to be sold into slavery is perhaps a significant part of slave mobility, yet the category is broader than just slave trade. Slaves or servants would accompany businessmen on trade journeys. They would be taken by bishops on their way to councils. They would have to chaperone students who take on studies in Rome, Alexandria, or Athens. These servants or slaves are, however, by and large invisible, as Ronald Charles has demonstrated in his monograph, The Silencing of Slaves in Early Jewish and Christian Texts. Likewise, Candida Moss has recently explored the topic of rendering visible slave scribes in our ancient text. Basically, one may argue that wherever these exceptional elite men and women would go on their globe-trotting adventures, and whatever literary records they left behind, there would be servants and slaves in their cohorts who would have to undertake these journeys and assist their masters in their goings about. That is why below I will speak of forced mobility. This, I think, is where we may raise the question Orlando Patterson has addressed of natal alienation. Although, again, sources are silent about the identity and background of individual servants, which makes Patterson's concept only possible if redefined to fit an ancient context. Yet, his basic ideas of a person being uprooted, cut off from their social heritage and context, to be thrown into a different culture may be a valid question to ask, especially when it concerns forced migration that we find in slaves belonging to women who settle in the Holy Land. To add to the complexity of the matter, whereas slaves and servants who could accompany elite men and women in public would mostly be male, including eunuchs, women in the lower strata of society, in servant-slave rules, would be mostly confined to the domestic sphere. One may reasonably assume that women of lower status, and thus without the means and resources available to elite women, would be rather unlikely to embark on voluntary long-distance journeys. By contrast, one might be able to find such women forced to undertake involuntary mobility and migration, that is, for captive women as prisoners of war, as war booty, or as slaves. Here I must mention Magistinos Carlos' study of one such woman, namely the Germanic Bisulla as war booty of Ausonius. Carlos' study proves that, even though our sources are scarce, There may be individual instances that help us picture forced mobility or forced migration of women in antiquity, which may be indicative of broader trends and patterns. And that brings me to my case study. Jerome and his women have been the focus of much scholarly work for many generations. But what about the servants and slaves? First, I'll offer some general examples of how Jerome portrays slaves and servants, and then I'll look into some examples where we might detect forced mobility. As I've just argued, slaves and servants appointed with various tasks, chambermaids to scribes, are always present in the background, part of the furniture, so to speak. Slaves are assumed to just be there. In fact, they are considered part of the household. And as per custom, there are not many passages where slaves are acknowledged. So I'll sketch two examples of strands where slaves do become visible. The first is passages that explicitly mention patron-slave relations, and the second pertains to tasks assigned to slaves. And the first one is the one on the screen. Paula's daughter Eustochium, the addressee of Jerome's famous treatise on virginity, Letter 22, is advised to choose his servants well. One may suggest that this is what is hinted at in this passage, where Jerome urges Eustochium to try to convince others, probably servants, to share her vocation. She is to treat virgins among her servants with greatest respect and support them if they experience hardship. Similar words of advice are found in letter to Furia and Demetrius, who are also told to be highly critical when selecting domestic servants. Furthermore, Jerome records how Demetrius' example was followed by a host of both clients and servants. Virginity was warmly espoused in every house, and although those who made a profession of it were, as regards of the flesh, of lower rank than Demetrius, they sought one reward with her, the reward of chastity. This suggests that conversion of the pater or mater familias often may have meant that all domestic staff would have had to convert. Supporting evidence can also be found in Jerome's eulogy on Paula, where he attests of servants that had accompanied Paula and Eustochium to Bethlehem and now live in their monastery, albeit in separate wings. And I just offer one example of tasks, and I'll restrict myself to scribes, because I'll come back to this below, so that will tie nicely in with the forced mobility question. So Jerome makes a very interesting remark in one of his early letters, letter 5 to Florentinus. Here he presents his scribes as pupils. It hints at the importance of having slaves that were highly trained and skilled. In a letter to Lasinus, Jerome feigns that any mistake Lasinus would find in his works, Lasinus' servants would be to blame. Furthermore, again in relation to training and the lack thereof, Jerome writes to Theodora about the dire situation in the Holy Land when it comes to scribes. When we want to look at forced mobility of servants and slave girls, we truly have to read between the lines. Again, I'll offer three examples: Jerome himself, Lasinus, and Paula. My last example of Jerome's own servants already points us in the right direction. His acknowledgement that he brought his entire library along wherever he traveled implies that he must have had a significant entourage of servants to schlep his volumes. Similarly, his comment about scribes suggests that he had taken along scribes on his journeys. It is not always clear if he had hired them and they came along voluntarily, or whether they had no choice and therefore that their journeys may be understood as forced mobility. When he writes about a lack of scribes who know Latin once he has settled in Bethlehem, this seems to imply rather clearly that he must have resorted to local services offered. However, when he dwells in the desert of Chalcis in Syria, or rather the estate of Evagrius, he does seem to allude that the scribes surrounding him are his own. This makes his comment in a letter to Rusticus all the more interesting, as he complains about those who swarm in crowds of servants yet claim the name of hermit. Some of Jerome's antagonists actually accused Jerome of not living the life of a true hermit, as he allegedly shared his cave with a horde of female scribes. The example alluded to above, namely that Luscinus' scribes may offer space for imagination. Luscinus is recorded to have sent a group of scribes to the Holy Land, where they've been assigned the task of copying Jerome's scholarly works. Naturally, this suggests that Luscinus was a man of vast wealth who had the resources to send a group of servants from Spain to Bethlehem to have books copied. The cost of that voyage alone must have been incredible, and the time it would take these scribes to travel there and back, let alone copy those works, must have been significant also. These scribes must have been away from their home base for months, if not a full year. Jerome does suggest that they have witnessed him suffering from illness, and there's some other allusions that suggest that they might have spent quite a few months in Bethlehem. Unfortunately, it's impossible to determine the gendered aspect for Luscinus' servants, although Jerome's vocabulary may suggest that it concerns male servants. The gendered aspect may be easier to identify in my final example, Jerome's Paula. In his epitaph, Jerome describes a journey which he and Paula undertook from Rome to their eventual place of settlement in Bethlehem. The passage had often been studied in context of pilgrimage, and recently I've analyzed it in looking for visual perspective of the Mediterranean. However, what would the text reveal if one takes a different approach, namely asking the question related to the invisible slave girls? Jerome acknowledges how, for the first part of the journey, Paula was accompanied by her daughter Eustochium and her slave girls. Moreover, these slave girls are identified as virgins. This implies that they've likely taken up their matron's vocation, yet they did not lose their slave status. With Paula seemingly having no intention to return to Rome, these slave girls had to accept that they were relocating permanently to a remote desert village in the Holy Land, after having lived in the largest and most significant metropolis of the empire. These slave girls would be assigned residence in a separate wing of the monastery that Paula was to found. It is evident from Jerome's letter that social hierarchy was preserved within the convent, as he writes how Paula divided into 3 companies and monasteries the numerous virgins whom she had gathered out of different provinces, some of whom are noble of birth, while others belonged to the middle or lower classes. But although they worked and had their meals separately from each other, these 3 companies met together for psalm singing and prayer. Moreover, noble women joining the convent were not only expected to bring along their servants, it is also evident that, in spite of radically choosing ascetic life in the monastery, they were assumed to keep being served. The only difference was that she ought to be served by slaves not belonging to her own, but to a peer, as Jerome recalls Paula's rules that stated if a virgin was noble by birth, she was not allowed to have an attendant belonging to her own household, lest the maid, having her mind full of the doings of old days and of license of childhood, might by constant converse open old wounds and renew former errors. Since these noble women joined Paula's monastery coming from all over the world, this implies that slaves were uprooted from their homes and forced to live in Bethlehem Monastery, where they were stationed in different wings from their matrons and were assigned to the service of other women than their owner. As I've shown in the sources, servants or slave girls are anonymized into a collective mass. It is only possible to reconstruct their lives and livelihoods by reading between the lines and looking how the lives of their masters unfold. For example, Paula's servants, from the comfort of their respectable domus in Rome, they were forced to embark on an arduous and challenging journey that would take them to the Holy Land, where they were to settle in a monastery. Monastic life, including virginity, was forced upon them, and migration was forced upon them. Joining a monastery did not imply that social status became redundant. We have seen how noble virgins still had slaves attending to them, and how servants seem to have had to follow their masters or matrons to a monastery. Here they were put in different quarters, assigned to the service of other noble virgins. They remained slaves, and seem not to have had a choice to return to, for example, Rome. Hypothesizing then about possible natal alienation, when people are sold into slavery and shipped to a faraway city, or when they are uprooted from their hometown because their patron or matron decides to embark on long-distance journeys, sometimes even migrating permanently, this sadly remains a ground of pure speculation only. However, it might be a helpful exercise nonetheless to help us think and reflect what our ancient elite sources tell us and what they explicitly do not tell us along the lines of Charles' silencing of slaves. Perhaps we may imagine the lived experience of these servants or slave girls a bit like the example with which I started my talk. The travel-sick Eugenie, who is dragged along on long-distance voyages with her matron, Anne Lister. There are recurring scenes throughout the series that show a reluctant girl being forced on long journeys because she had been hired into the service of a curious explorer. The difference here is that Eugenie had accepted this job. Her ancient predecessor likely had far less of a choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I really look forward to discussing that afterwards. Very stimulating. The next speaker is Truls Myrup Christensen. He is an associate professor of classical art and archaeology at the School of Culture and Society, Aarhus University. Truls Myrup Christensen is a colleague of Uusimäki, although in a different subject area. He is in charge of the program in classical antiquity and its heritage. He was trained in Aarhus, but also Leicester, Cambridge, Winnipeg, Athens, and Rome. He recently finished 2 large-scale collaborative research projects, The Emergence of Sacred Travel, Experience, Economy, and Connectivity in Ancient Mediterranean Pilgrimage, funded by the Danish Council for Independent Research, and the Horizon 2020 funded COHERE, Performing and Representing European Identities. His research interests lie broadly within the study of visual culture in the ancient world, the material cultures of ancient pilgrimage, late antique art and archaeology, as well as the contemporary consumption of heritage. And he has published widely on the archaeology of ancient Mediterranean pilgrimage and is currently working on a book about religious mobility in the ancient world. Please.
Thank you so much. And let me start by just also, again, congratulating Elisa on her award and the invitation to be here, and for the invitation to be here today. So what I want to do in my contribution is to look at what archaeology can bring to the study of female mobility in the ancient Mediterranean, as well as some of the associated problems of interpretation. So the book that Göran just alluded to is the book I'm currently writing, which is intended as an archaeological history of pilgrimage, ambitiously covering the period from the early 1st millennium BCE all the way up to the late 1st millennium CE. But what I want to do here is focus my contribution on archaic Greece. In fact, my focus will be a single sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Hera, that is located on the Argive plain in the Peloponnese, not far from Mycenae, and about 8 kilometers northeast of the important city of Argos. This is an extra-urban sanctuary, meaning that most visitors would have traveled from some distance to get there. So, for example, we have the story in Herodotus about Cleobis and Biton, who tells us of the procession that connected the Heraean with Argos, and some of the rituals that tied the civic community and the sanctuary together. And important in that story is also their mother, a priestess of Hera. So already here we have an example of a particular type of female mobility. And what you're seeing on the screen here are some views of the sanctuary, specifically the remains of the classical period, the more monumental temple that is also described by Pausanias. Its predecessor, the so-called Old Temple, we know much less about that, but it certainly dates to back to the Archaic period at least, and that was located on a terrace just above what you're seeing here. And on that terrace, we had the earliest activity in the sanctuary. The whole sanctuary is built on these artificial terraces that have been described like a man-made acropolis, and that offer striking views of the entire Argive plain, as you also get some sense of in the image here. Now, I want to focus on the Argo of Iran, not only because it was an important sanctuary, but also because it tells us at least two different mobility stories in which gender, and specifically female agency, features in strikingly different ways. But before I go any further, we'll need to zoom out a little bit and look at the state of scholarship on ancient Greek religion more broadly. This is a field that in many ways is going through what we could call a pilgrimage turn, a wave of new scholarship on different forms of religious mobility. And this really began to pick up pace in Anglophone scholarship in the late 1990s, and really I think it continues to thrive. Indeed, this very occasion that we are at today reflects the fact that mobility is something of a contemporary obsession. Now, the books that you see here on the screen represent different dimensions of what I would refer to as this pilgrimage turn. Some are devoted to individual pieces of evidence, while others focus on wider mechanisms through which sanctuaries attracted pilgrims from different parts of the Greek world, and even in labeling particular authors, such as Pausanias, as pilgrims. And this is in fact quite telling, as the volumes also focused almost entirely on textual evidence. And this ranges from casual references to pilgrims in literary narratives to the more formal context of theoric inscriptions that give the names of individual officials sent from a polis to a sanctuary to oversee rituals. These texts, they're also typically one-sided in terms of the gender, so they often talk about male mobility, and also, as we just saw in some ways, status. They're often about elite mobility. So while there certainly was a considerable number of female pilgrims in the Greek world, the amount of attention paid to gender varies in quite striking ways and greatly throughout modern scholarship. And an important reason for the lack of attention to other groups of pilgrims, including women, is the difficulty of identifying their activities through material culture. Nonetheless, trying to carve out a place for the archaeology of pilgrimage or for the archaeology in the long-term history of pilgrimage, that was one of the key ambitions of this collaborative project that was also mentioned in the introduction that I finished a few years ago. And you see some of the work that we did here that sets out to look at different aspects of ancient mobilities and developing more like a method for how we could do an archaeology of pilgrimage. And there is, in fact, more in the pipeline from this project. So a central argument that we were making in this project is that if we're going to be successful in locating mobility in the archaeological record, and specifically gendered mobility at that, we need a solid methodological grounding to do so. So in my own work, I have been building on theoretical perspectives that come from this another turn, as it were, the so-called new mobilities paradigm. And again, I'm just giving you here a very small sample of the literature that relates to this new mobilities paradigm. This paradigm, a term, describes a broader methodological direction that focuses on relations, connections, and networks, and to explore the implications of the observation that travel is not just a question of getting to the destination. And that has become like a motto for this paradigm and keeps appearing in publications. So in contrast to much other sociological work on mobilities that focuses on social aspects or operate at this abstract level, this paradigm explicitly turns to spatial and material dimensions of mobility. Much of the research that has been carried out within the paradigm is indeed firmly anchored in the type of everyday mobilities and mundane spaces that archaeologists typically work with. So even though mobility is by its very nature an ephemeral practice, it is dependent on a large number of immobile infrastructures that some scholars within this paradigm have referred to as moorings or spatial fixes. And I guess we can take a case in point from our own world, seemingly wireless, mobility fixated in all sorts of ways, but we're still deeply dependent on an increasingly wide range of logistical digital infrastructure, from airports to mobile antennas, the whole lot. So a mobile world is also fundamentally a material world. The paradigm challenges many key aspects of how ancient Mediterranean sanctuaries have studied and offers a wide range of heuristic and comparative tools with significant potential for the study of Greek religion more broadly, including the study of gendered mobility. So one of the sort of frameworks that I'm drawing from this field is John Urie's discussion of the term mobility system that sets out to overcome the widespread tendency across the social sciences to understand mobility as a black box, something that just happens. According to Urie, mobility systems are organized around the processes that circulate people, objects, and information at various spatial ranges and speeds. All of these different elements of a mobility system empower particular mobilities, such as pilgrimages undertaken to sanctuaries or other sacred places. Similar to some of the mobility systems of our own age, ancient Greek pilgrimage produced a hierarchy of places in terms of location, level of access, and the scale of mobility. For example, in the development of theoric networks and interregional so-called pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. Individuals and groups participate and invest in the mobility system of pilgrimage for what it gives them back in terms of a particular type of mobility capital, notably religious experiences, cultural knowledge, political status, or economic gain. And this was true for both men and women. So this is a term, mobility system, that might seem somewhat abstract and of an immaterial character, but its application should be anything but. So previous research on Greek sanctuaries traditionally has focused on abstract concepts such as territory, networks, or catchment, all of which essentially relies on a two-dimensional approach and fundamentally lacks any sense of experienced space. In contrast, approaching ancient Greek pilgrimage as a mobility system focuses on its material embodied elements, including gender. So we can now return to the Argive plain, where the Heraeon is a well-suited place to apply some of these methods, not least because of its paradigmatic role in several important studies of the political and religious landscape of Greece. One influential reconstruction of the mobility system of the Argive Heraeon is that of the French scholar François de Polignac. In his important work on the role played by sanctuaries in the formation of the early Greek polis, Polignac uses the Argive Heraeon as his model case of how an extra-urban sanctuary functioned as a marker of territorial control and as a symbol of power within its landscape. So in his view, the mobility system of the Heraeon represents the rise of Argos as an important political center on the Argive plain and in the wider Peloponnesian landscape, and it sought to manifest and define Argos's control or power through the construction of a religious gathering place at the edge of its territory. A strength of this approach is that rather than seeing sanctuaries in isolation from the wider political social landscape, it places them within a wider network of relations and is linked to the rise of institutions. However, by treating the outer space of the Argive Heraeon as a function of state formation, other forms of mobility to the sanctuary disappear from view. Polignac's interpretation, in fact, tells us rather little in terms of why individuals choose to invest in going to the Heraeon and participate in processions and rituals. Ultimately, then, Polignac's model masks and obscures the complexity of the mobility system that the sanctuary was part of, as well as the multiple forms of mobility capital that it produced through pilgrimage visitation. Closer integration of the archaeology, in fact, allows us to reconstruct other mobility systems in relation to the Argive Heraeon, in which female agency is likely to have played an important, even defining role. This is reflected in several bodies of evidence from the site and its wider landscape. And this is particularly the votive finds that have been excavated in the sanctuary and that date from the 8th through the 6th century and are particularly important to think about these issues as they represent both civic and personal commemoration and ritual activities. Now, the problem of working with these, and here we're getting into some of those problems of interpretation, is that most of them were discovered in relatively unsystematic excavations in the late 19th century. And there is really a very small amount of high-quality data available to allow us to interpret this sort of wider context of these dispositions of votives. However, there is one important exception to this rule, and that is the material from a deposit that was excavated right at the end of the Greek Civil War in September 1949 by an international French-American team led by Pierre Amandry, who's more known for his work at Delphi, and John Caskey, and you see their images here on the screen. The two men were also joined by Caskey's wife, Elizabeth, who's referred to simply in the publications as Mrs. Caskey. So here we have some of those gender politics of archaeology, and I think that it's important to pay tribute to this female pioneer in Mediterranean field archaeology, also in this context today. In the publication, Amandry and Caskey describe their work as having been carried out in the happiest and most harmonious spirit of cooperation. I think this is quite a statement, seeming that we're right at the end of the Greek Civil War. So anyway, the work just lasted 5 days, but it produced a substantial corpus of more than 900 complete, but rather humble parts. The pottery, you see a very small selection of it here, was discovered in a deposit in close vicinity to a stepped retaining wall that marks the eastern edge of the sanctuary. The excavators note that many of the finds were not only complete, so they had to be deliberately deposited, but also that they were lying close-packed like eggs in a basket. And you get perhaps some sense of that in this image just above me. So what we have here is a deliberate deposition of votives that were cleared out at some point, presumably around the middle of the 6th century. The material in the deposit dates from the 7th to the 6th centuries, representing an assemblage of material accumulated over a considerable period of time. Most of the finds are small, inexpensive, certainly representing something other and something else than the elite practices reflected in the dedication of bronze tripods and kuroi. The most numerous among the finds are these little hodriskai that you see images of here on the screen. And these are very tiny little miniature versions of hydriai or water jugs with 3 handles, typically just about 5 to 10 centimeters in height. Quite intriguing objects. Obviously, when you're downsizing an object like this, they also lose some of their original function. There's been found about 300 of these, suggesting a repeated practice of coming to the sanctuary with these objects and using them for ritual purposes. While this ritual poses all sorts of other questions, the sheer number of parts and their deposition in a single area of the sanctuary attest to a broader mobility system based on a community of practice, specifically a female-empowered practice. This is obviously not an easy call to make. We may, for example, object to how Amandry and Caskey take it for granted that the pottery that they found should have been deposited, and I give you the quote up here, by not only women, but poor women who could afford no richer gifts. In fact, in a speculative footnote, they go even further and suggest that they had been made by girls or even quite young women with whom the toy-like miniatures would be in keeping. More recent work has in fact reassessed the role of miniature pottery, as in work by Signe Barfoel, who notes that these small vessels not only had a votive function, but also a commemorative one. So they're not toys. These are objects with rich symbolic ritual significance. It has also been suggested that part of their appeal was that they were small and lightweight, making them easy for pilgrims to bring on a journey. Yet even in light of such reassessments of previous invitations of this category of find, the key passage in Amandry and Caskey still stands. The Argo of Iran is not primarily a men's shrine. And this is in fact further supported by, as they point out, the hundreds of objects that they were dedicated at the site of the Iran, including bronze dress pins, mirrors, and the like. These suggest the presence of a significant number of female pilgrims who had a range of individual motivations for visiting the site other than to demonstrate a particular type of civic loyalty. The triangulation of female agency, water, and ritual at the Hurrian is in fact also specifically referred to in a passage in Pausanias that I give you here on the screen. This pilgrim author describes how the women who came to the Hurrian used water in rituals of purification and for sacrifice, and that these are aporitoi, literally meaning unsayable or something that's held in secret. Even so, the pottery from the 1949 excavations at the Hurrian and the associated rituals offer insights into some of those other mobility systems in which the Argive Hurrian was enmeshed, giving us an example of a practice that compelled women to travel time and time again for at least 2 centuries during the Archaic period. So more than anything, this case highlights the importance of looking more closely into the archaeology of pilgrimage and the need to investigate in much more detail gendered spaces, gendered objects, and gendered experiences, and how these are integral to different mobility systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Again, lots of things for further discussion here. Wonderful. I would like to introduce the final speaker of the panel, who is Lynn Foubert, who focuses on the gender dynamics of changing societies through the lens of women's movements in the ancient Mediterranean. Belgian-born Foubert did her PhD in the Netherlands on the gendered representations of Julio-Claudian women in imperial literature and imagery. Afterwards, she published a frequently mentioned monograph on Agrippina the Younger. Since 2012, she is faculty member of the Department of History, Art History and Classics at the Radboud University in Nijmegen, where she chairs Radboud's teaching programs in history. Her expertise covers a broad range of topics across classics and cultural studies. She has in the past studied, for example, pre-modern examples of tourism and the impact of Rome's military infrastructure on the whereabouts of women in the Roman world. At the moment, she focuses on the gender dynamics of changing societies and strategies of individuals and groups to restore or maintain a status quo, a subject which she tackles through the lens of women's movements in the ancient Mediterranean. She also experiments with new ways to build bridges between scholarship, society, and visual arts. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And with the risk, they're getting there, with the risk of repeating myself, I want to congratulate Elisa, but also thank you so much for inviting us. And as has been said before, it's been a while since we got to get into a conversation amongst ourselves. So it's very nice to be here today. So thank you. This paper today is less about historical reality than it is about the ways in which people try to come to terms with the crisis they face. It is about how the Romans saw the movements of women as a key to their way of life. And I begin my story in the 3rd century. The historian Lucius Cassius Dio decided to relate how the elites of the city of Rome faced one of the darkest periods in the capital's history, and he did so in much detail. His book, Roman History, took up 80 volumes in which he covered 1400 years of Rome's past. He spent 1/5 of his work to a mere 50 years. To what scholars have been calling the crisis of the Roman Republic, the period of civil war in the final decades of the 1st century before our Common Era. Born in the Roman province of Bithynia, and with a high-profile career as a Roman senator, Cassius Dio clearly felt that this violent conflict amongst Rome's citizens had determined the development of the Roman Empire and its elites. Being a prominent citizen himself, he felt connected to his republican predecessors. Their fates could always become his. In the years before Cassius Dio started writing, he witnessed the effects of civil war on human lives from up close. The year 193 was the year of the 5 emperors. After the assassination of the Emperor Commodus, 5 men claimed the title of Roman Emperor. Pertinax, who held the throne for 3 months, Didius Julianus, who managed to hold on for 9 weeks, and Septimius Severus, who in the end would prevail for 18 years. But before it came to that, Septimius Severus' claim was contested by 2 men from outside of the capital. The Roman legions in Syria declared Pescennius Niger as sole emperor, while the legions in Britannia proclaimed Clodius Albinus. The proclamations of the soldiers signaled the beginning of an armed conflict between Roman citizens that stretched from one side of the Roman Empire to the other. So far, I have described these events from the perspectives of bearded men. It's there. Obviously, violent conflicts like these hit women and children just as hard. While Pescennius Niger was in Syria, his wife, who remains nameless in the ancient evidence, and children had stayed behind in Rome. They were taken hostage and sent into exile to an unknown location. However, when Pescennius Niger was defeated and beheaded, and Clodius Albinus revolted in Britannia, Septimius Severus ordered to have the wife and children of Pescennius Niger murdered, their estates confiscated, and everyone in their household blotted out. A warning to anyone related to Clodius Albinus, or any other who decided to contest Septimius Severus' claim that he knew their weaknesses. It is with this eyewitness knowledge that Cassius Dio turned to the elites of the Republican civil wars in the 1st century BCE. According to the author, war divided the Roman citizens in 2 groups, the movers and the stayers. When describing the events of 49 BCE, when Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and marched towards Rome, Dio explains that there were those who left Rome and the Italian peninsula and took their entire household with them. They said farewell to their temples, to their homes, and to the soil of their ancestors, knowing that these would become the property of their enemies. They traveled to the Greek provinces of the eastern Mediterranean with the intention of settling there. They had, so Dio implies, given up. They would not return to their patria, their homeland. Dramatically illustrated here by the 19th century painter Adolphe Yvon, where you see the family on the left trying to hold on to their patria. But then there were those who left everyone behind. In doing so, they seemingly gave the impression that they still had hope to return to their home country one day. Their belief that there still was a possible future was praiseworthy. Nonetheless, their decision was worse, so Dio explains, because they delivered all that was dear to them in the power of their foes. The fate of Pescennius Niger's family had illustrated to the author how that was true. Women, children, those who were unable to travel because of illnesses or old age, were deprived of their guardians and unable to defend themselves, exposed to war. They were angry, so the author continues, because they felt deserted by their menfolk, or conflicted because they supported the flight from the city, fearing that the same disastrous fate would befall also to their brothers, husbands, or sons if they stayed. No one knew what to do. Anyone who saw them would have supposed that two peoples and two cities were being made from one, and that the one group was being driven out and was going into exile, while the other was being left to its fate and taken captive. Cassius Dio wrote more than 2 centuries after the Republican Civil Wars and was, like every writer, shaped by the events and traumas of his own time. His narrative was biased and distorted. Yet the universal and transhistorical truth behind the author's words can hardly be called into question, as recent events in Kabul and in the Ukraine have once again made painfully clear. But to what extent can we corroborate Dio's division in movers and stayers and the impossible situation both groups found themselves in with contemporary or near-contemporary evidence? We have no eyewitness account written by women of Rome, nothing that could elucidate how women themselves thought about the decision they were faced with, to accompany their menfolk in their forced migration, or to stay behind and become responsible for their remaining households, nor whether it was in fact their decision to make. All of the ancient evidence that deals with this period is written from the perspective of men, as has already been pointed out for other periods. We come closest to a woman's perspective through the letters of Marcus Tullius Cicero, who documented the panic and chaos that followed Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, and who voices his concerns when writing to his wife Terentia and their daughter Tullia. When Caesar had symbolically declared war by crossing the Rubicon with his armies, Terentia and Tullia were in Rome. A couple of weeks before, they had traveled to the harbor city of Brundisium, Rome's gateway to the eastern Mediterranean, where they had welcomed Cicero back home after his term as a governor in the province of Cilicia, present-day Turkey. Terentia and Tullia had journeyed back to Rome, but Cicero decided to retreat to his coastal estates in Formia. It was a political decision. As a proconsul overseeing a foreign province, he was awarded imperium, an institutionalized authority that allowed him to command Rome's legion. If he would return to the capital and cross its borders, he would lose his military command, a centuries-old agreement to protect the citizens of Rome from trigger-fingered generals. Considering the tense and violent situation, Cicero decided to stay put and have the neighboring soldiers armed and ready to command with the authority to do so. Terentia and Tullia were largely left by themselves, protected somewhat by the presence of Tullia's husband Dolabella when one of Caesar's supporters. And Cicero writes to them, "My dear hearts, I think you should yet again carefully consider what you are to do, whether you should stay in Rome or with me or in some place of safety. The decision is yours as well as mine." Cicero adds that when Caesar's troop would attack and plunder the capital, their decision to stay, protected by Dolabella, might make them appear as supporters of Caesar and thus keep them safe. However, Cicero states that I am concerned when I observe that all honest men have left Rome and have their womenfolk with them. Moreover, the district where I am is full of towns friendly to me and also of properties of mine, so that you could be with me a good deal, and when we are separated could live comfortably in places of our own. Frankly, I have not yet made up my mind which is the better course. You must observe what other ladies of your rank are doing. He urges them to make up their minds before it is too late, before the ways out of Rome are blocked. One day later, he feels that perhaps even the protection of Dolabella will not be enough, emphasizing once more that there remains the question on which you yourselves will be the best judges, whether other ladies in your positions are staying in Rome. If they are not, you should consider whether you can do so without discredit. Cicero's concerns were twofold. He worried about their personal safety, about what Caesar's soldiers may do to them if they attacked the city. And what complicated matters further was that Tullia was pregnant. He also worried about the political significance that his social peers would read into their staying behind in Rome. After all, Terentia was the wife of one of Rome's most powerful citizens. If she was the only upper-class woman left in the capital who awaited Caesar's arrival, whether by choice or by force because the roads were blocked, that could have been interpreted as a political act, a token of support towards Caesar. It would eradicate all of Cicero's attempts to keep the peace through diplomacy and finalize any decision still to make on whether he should join Caesar's campaign or that of Caesar's opponent Pompey. In the end, they decided to leave and join Cicero at their seaside estate. Based on Cicero's letters, the final decision seems to have been theirs. The women elite's dilemma, as presented by Cicero, aligns perfectly with the picture painted by Cassius Dio, who may very well have used Cicero's letters as his main source. Cassius Dio, however, stripped women of their agency. They do not decide to stay behind, they are left. Other writers, both near contemporaries and those writing 2 or 3 generations after the events, have discussed the whereabouts of elite women during the decades of civil strife. So let's talk a little bit about numbers. And you may want to turn around for this bit. Sorry. This heat map summarizes the coverage of women movers and stayers in the ancient sources up until Cassius Dio. Each bar represents an individual woman. When the bars are vertically aligned, we are dealing with the same woman. The first bar, for instance, represents Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony. The collected source material shows that the ancient writers were almost equally interested in documenting wives who moved in times of civil unrest, a total of 22, those in blue, as in explicitly framing women as stayers, a total of 20, those in yellow. Unfortunately, I do not have time to share the stories of all these women with you, but let me offer you 2 of them. The Latin writer and near contemporary to the civil wars, Valerius Maximus, tells us the story of the wife of Quintus Lucretius, who became a victim of the next wave of civil war that came about after the assassination of Julius Caesar. When he was marked as a target by the powers that be, Quintus Lucretius was hidden by his wife Tullia between the ceiling and the roof of their bedroom. Valerius Maximus explains that when others barely escaped in alien and hostile regions at the price of cruel torture of body and mind, he, thanks to her extraordinary loyalty, kept his life. The author describes Tullia as an active agent. She is the one who takes charge of hiding her husband, an endeavor that was not without risk, so he emphasizes. What is more, her staying transforms her husband into a stayer as well. Contrary to many of his social peers, Quintus Lucretius was not forced to leave his patria behind. Valerius Maximus considers him blessed because of it. He adds a second story of that same period, a story about Sulpicia, not a stayer like Tullia, but a mover. She too is presented as an active agent, making her own choices. Sulpicia was held in custody by her mother Julia to prevent her from following Lentulus Cruscellio to Sicily, her husband who was also put on the list of proscriptions. Nonetheless, she reached him in a secret flight, dressed as a servant along with 2 enslaved girls and 2 enslaved men. Whereas Tullia's presence in Rome tied her husband to the capital and in doing so prevented him to turn to foreign lands and a non-Roman way of life, Sulpicia wanted to join her husband in his flight to the Greek Mediterranean. Valerius Maximus emphasizes how she overcame different obstacles. She escaped the watchful eye of her mother, and by dressing like a servant and traveling as one of them, she deliberately set aside the matronal dignitas that accompanied her rank. Sulpicia's journey also appears in the 2nd century Appian's Roman history, who adds that Lentulus explicitly ordered her not to follow him abroad, an order she ignored as soon as she learned where he stayed. Appian ends the story by explaining how after a difficult siege voyage, Sulpicia found him in a disheveled state because of their separation, implying that her presence in Sicily made Lentulus whole again, restored his self-esteem, his dignitas. A comparison between stories about movers and stayers clarifies that the makeup of the anecdotes, the values that are involved, the emotions these stories invoke, and their function in the text in which they appear are almost identical. Incorporating the stay-behind wife offers a writer the opportunity to let a woman perform her traditional role as a mother or a wife. In the absence of her husband or male relatives, often risking her own life, she excels in protecting their property and their lives. In doing so, she acted like a lifeline for her male relatives at a time when the proscriptions forced elite men out of the Italian peninsula, which stripped men from their wealth, political functions, class and status markers. Women in Rome salvaged the elite's dignitas through their actions and moral behavior. But the companioning wife plays a similar role in the writer's narrative. In most texts, she functions as the embodiment of the Roman household. When taking her with him, a husband not only finds himself morally supported by a travel companion, he also brings with him Rome. Picturing women as the embodied link between the displaced elite men of Rome and their patria is a common thread in literary discourse from Republican to early or mid-imperial writers, in history, biography, exemplary literature, or oratory. Contrary to what one might expect, stay-behind wives were not considered more in accordance with society's moral compass than the wives who joined their husbands abroad. The main brushstrokes of the literary portraits are similar. The good ones, a majority in the source material, excel in courage and self-sacrifice, display loyalty towards their husbands, and showcase matronal dignitas. Women, both the movers and the stayers, epitomize the Roman elite household. As a mater familias, a wife guarantees, at least in theory, the elite's household's continuity. Ancient writers treated her as the embodiment of the traditional republican values that were at stake in the military conflict between the leading men of Rome. Women were men's anchor points. They brought stability in a period of crisis. They were both household and homeland. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. And this concludes the part of this seminar with the individual presentations. We will now move on to the conversation. And as I have said a couple of times along the way, you know, there is so much in each individual presentation that it would be wonderful to discuss, but since we don't have that much time, I think we should at least start with the more general overall topic and see where it takes us. So my question to start all of this off would be, like, have we made any progress on the question of women's mobility in historical perspective? And then historical could stand for the material, and perspective could stand for the more theoretical, methodological approaches to the question. Elisa, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are lots of answers could be given to your question, and I think we are having a more colorful picture. At least I am having a more colorful picture after these presentations, and lots of different aspects could be highlighted. But maybe I just mention a few. So first of all, this idea of travel as somehow disruptive or even revolutionary because of moving women from the private to the public domain. So on the one hand, it has this kind of radical aspect to it, but then I think also what, for instance, Jessica's presentation reminded us was that also like social hierarchies still remain and inequalities, say, between different women are not or do not disappear along with mobility. So on the one hand, this it's dynamic and certain something changes and is even radical, but then at the same time, it is also a conservative phenomenon in terms of not breaking those down. Another thing I was thinking, what was highlighted in some of the presentations of travel as a kind of social and communal phenomenon. So we are often thinking of individual movers and travelers from a modern viewpoint, but even when we talk about these ancient celebrity travelers, I think the presentations today have highlighted how also in the case of, say, celebrity movers, we have retinues and larger groups that are enabling the travel and traveling. So maybe that social communal aspect was something I see better after hearing these presentations. Another issue is this travel and home. So of course, home is the kind of polar opposite of travel and movement. And I was thinking during the presentations that what we can learn about ancient conceptions of home when we look at these various forms of travel and women's mobility and how women on the one hand are imagined as these homebound figures, but then also it seems that in many cases the homes are not fixed, and also the homes move, and there would probably be a lot to say in that. I find very interesting the glimpses of travel as an aspect of lived ancient religion, which is now a paradigm that has been emerging in recent yes, and some would say an oxymoronic concept. How can we study something like lived ancient religion? But I think in these presentations, we saw that it's difficult, but aspects of it emerge when we look at the material carefully. Maybe final note, as for Truls' presentation in particular, you were talking about the different types of capital that are associated with travel, economic, but also immaterial, social and mental capital, and how travel is a way of gaining capital, but then also, like if we look at, say, slaves or servants, it might they might lose some social ties because of forced mobility, and how it's also something where you may lose social capital while maybe gaining new forms of it. I'm sure there would be much more, but maybe that's just some first reactions.
Starting from your question, have we made progress in the more general sense? And something that struck me when I heard the others speak is that in this particular field we've been fighting for so long to make it clear that women were part of this mobile society. So everyone was convinced that since the 80s, the 90s, since then, that the ancient Mediterranean was a mobile society, so that mobility was kind of the norm, but everyone kept talking in either genderless or sexless terms and excluding women from the discussion, because as you pointed out in your lecture, the women we found in our sources were considered as exceptional, and which narrowed the field in that sense, because they were not treated as an intrinsic part of this society. And what all your papers made clear is that, at least that's the hope that I have, that we are now ready to go beyond that point. So we established that they were part of that Mediterranean society, and now we can ask the really interesting questions. So what does that mean then for how societies work and how capital is, in all senses, is generated? So that was my brainwave.
Yeah, if I may also answer your question, I think I'm going to say yes, but there's still so much work still to do. I mean, and one thing that really struck me here is just how different our experience of travel is versus the ancient world. I mean, we're not really bothered about going 10 kilometers to a supermarket or even further for random bits of shopping, but obviously those kind of distances would have been experienced in a very different way in the ancient world. And it seemed to me that there's a real challenge here for how we'd approach mobility. A lot of what we've been talking about here has been this sort of long-range, global type of mobility. But obviously there are all sorts of other sort of short-range mobilities that would have been just as significant in the ancient world. I mean, not least the religious types of mobility. I mean, we could look at the one example of the Argo of Iran that I talked about. We can think about Elisa and the journey to Athens. You know, in our view, quite short distances, but something that would have been marked in all sorts of marked out in ritual ways, so that they would have had a different significance to us. And it seems to me we're still kind of stuck. We're thinking about mobility as something that's, you know, touring the world, like the sort of grand tour is still a big paradigm in the way that we approach this. But actually, those short-range mobilities are a real interesting question that I think we need to think more about. The social dynamics about those things was another thing that I was really struck by throughout the different presentations. I'm sort of uneasy about all these authors talking about a single person traveling, but you know, we get glimpses in a lot of these, like Algeria, we get glimpses that there are obviously other travelers that are along. Some are male, some are other women. So there's these forms of co-mobility, how you move as a group, the social dynamics of that group, traveling on a road, maybe by foot, chatting, singing, whatever they're doing, dancing, as we also know in some Greek examples. So there's all sorts of mobility that are not just about moving across the globe, but much more marked out in other ways, but quite short. And I'm not sure that we have, I mean, it might require different methods, different approaches to actually kind of approach those kind of questions, getting at the social dynamics of not just the long-range travel, but also those short-range journeys from Argos out to the Argo of Iran, which is just 8 kilometers. But going back and forth, that's pretty much a day by foot in the ancient world. So how those short-range mobilities and their dynamics is something that I think we can still try to come up with better methods to approach.
Yeah, if I can react to that, I agree. The problem is, of course, with working with the literary sources, is that only these exceptional stories have been preserved because they were worthy of memory. They were worthy to be preserved for posterity. So the more short-range travel is far less interesting, and therefore we hardly see it. But I mean, just to give a random example, in the inscriptions in Dura Europos, you see visitors from Palmyra, for example, which one could consider a short distance. Within Italy, between Venosa and Rome. Sorry, now I'm speaking about Jewish communities or Jewish individuals traveling. But yeah, I think that's a problem that we're faced with. But then you enter more the material aspect and graffiti, and so people leaving their names on buildings because they visited. I was here, which is something that you see in the Jewish building in Dura Europos, and then you can based on the names or the dialects in which they write, you can see, oh well, they came from Palmyra or somewhere close by, for example. But the long distance travel are the exceptional ones, and there we can find. I mean, that's where I found the women in Jerome and these Christian pilgrims. And pilgrims is another question mark.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Do they stay or are they returning? Then that is connected to the notion of home and moving away. Sorry, now I'm just rambling on.
No, that's
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, literary sources prioritize certain aspects, but then I think that's why we need archaeologists to remind us of all these concrete questions of everyday life, what kind of mobility was possible. And it is also true that there have been like attitude problems in among scholars, like it has been recently written about the kind of lack of interest in local, in antiquity, and how the term local has sometimes suffered from patronizing and even negative connotations as opposed to long distance or regional. So it is also something we just need to reconsider the value of the local in our understanding of the past.
One question that could cut across both several presentations, but also several then materials and methodological approaches is this distinction between the attending servants and slaves in the materials, because I have noticed that several of you have used both terminologies. So in these materials, do they distinguish between who are somehow just brought along for the ride and who are then in a kind of have a legal status as slaves, and how would that differ? Of course, this maybe applies most to Jessica's paper, but several of you were touching on this issue and how the travel might be different for those groups. Yeah?
The main body of material that I work with deals with elite, because it's about it's literature, but enslaved people are mentioned and servants are mentioned in particular when it causes disruption of what Romans felt was their way of, the elites felt what was their way of life. So the example that I mentioned before, for instance, an elite woman who would cross dresses, meaning that she steps away from her the role that society assigned to her, then they are mentioned, but that does not give us a lot of insight, or it does, but you need to read against the grain, but it doesn't give us a lot of insight about what travel and movement meant for enslaved people. So it says us something about society, but not necessarily about the lived life, as you mentioned, of enslaved people. So that's complicated from a literature perspective.
Yeah, and if I think of the terminology, for instance, in ancient Hebrew, so of course there are multiple terms denoting slaves and servants and concubines, and yeah, you have to look at carefully how to translate. But it's also like say something like a term for concubines. So in a way, you would think that it has some kind of status as a secondary wife, but then at the same time, actually they're often also treated as some kind of slaves, in the sense that they can't, say, escape oppressive situations or don't have the same status in the household as the actual wife. So even figures that are not called slaves would have slave-like status if we define slavery as phenomenon where you can't escape oppressive situations as it would be understood today. So yeah, we have to be careful with the terms.
You had a comment to the previous discussion. So.
Well, I think it takes us into also another question about this, whether these are sort of gendering. It's not just about status; it's also about how different categories are mixed or not mixed at specific occasions. So we know of certain categories of mobility that were clearly for one gender or the other. I guess the sort of typical example is the Olympic Games. Only men, but then we have the female version, the Haraya, that was, not long after the Olympic Games, would be then only women. And we other gender-exclusive festivals like the Thesmophoria, for instance. But what about those? What about that? Just your local sanctuary? Those are the other smaller sanctuaries where there would be much more mixing going on, different types of people, some free, some not free, different genders. And again, that's another question that we need to think more about, how those spaces, because a lot of the spaces would have been the same, but they would have been engendered in very different ways depending on who were using them and when they were using them. So it's a very interesting question.
Okay. There might also be questions in the audience. So we open up at this point. Any would like to comment or? I will also keep an eye on you, so if you don't have it right now, but in 2 minutes, that's fine, and we'll just continue the conversation up here. Yeah?
Can I also react to what Truus just said, and also because for the audience, we agree on that you need to put all the material that you have to the question that you want to answer before they start worrying that we disagree on this. But you said I'm anxious about these authors who mentioned that one specific women the other way around. I'm anxious when you try to put gender or class categories on material evidence, because when I was listening to you and you explained about those jugs, I was wondering, okay, but I see the hypothesis that this is women who brought it with them, but what if it was the deity that sort of determined the objects that people brought? So I realized that I was conflicted because I wanted to believe you because that would suit my case, but I was a bit curious, and the same with how do you put class on objects? I was wondering if you could enlighten me and us in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I have the same sort of anxiety about this. I think and there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this, sort of the gendering, those kind of, because obviously the kind of old, the quote I gave from Kaskia and Amandri is a good example of the sort of men coming in here and saying, oh, look at those little things, they must be toys for girls, right? And we're not there, but we're still, and I talk to people that work with this material, and it's not something that's sort of assumed explicitly anymore, but it's still there, this idea. And of course, in this particular, that they were used primarily by women. And, we have the whole sort of water culture with getting water in the hydria being a very female practice. And then you have Pausanias talking about this kind of thing, right. Specifically in relation to the Argo of Iran. So it becomes sort of like not a Frankenstein's monster, but a Pausanias' monster, which is sometimes really hard to resist, right? But I completely feel your unease about just putting these sort of gender labels without any kind of, you have to dig a little bit deeper.
But the trick is then to find patterns, so to assess more sanctuaries and more infrastructure, and then combining them with other types of evidence, and then once you have the pattern, 1 is an exception, 2 might be coincidence, but then 3 is a pattern, and then you're absolutely, and a lot more research needs to go into that, trying to understand how these objects are being used, who are using them. And obviously that's a very difficult question in terms of interpretation. How we associate these with the people who were using them and what they were using them for.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question from Professor Sissel Undheim. Do you have a microphone, perhaps?
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel and very stimulating presentations. I was just wondering, I think you all touched upon the vulnerability of women traveling, especially traveling long distance. So I just wondered if you could pick back on that and maybe elaborate, if you could, on how this vulnerability is seen in the sources or the source material that you work with. Thank you.
Who would like to start on that? You? Or you, Jessica?
I could try. Thank you, Cecil, for the question. I think this has to do with, Jerome, for example, often complains about long-distance travel and the dangers at sea. That's not particularly gender-specific. But he seems to imply the danger of women traveling alone, but maybe I'm just reading too much into the sources, or I'm reading between the lines, that's also possible, or I just project my own interpretation. But if you see that, you'd have to wait and normally if people would travel by ship, they would have to go to the harbour and haggle with a trade goods ship that would sail from Athens to Antioch, just to give a random example. And so they're not just subject to like time of the year, the current, but also who is sailing. Well, you're aboard on a trade ship, basically, trade vessel. There's no passenger ship sailing. If a woman's alone, that would be rather, that could cause some trouble, so to speak. She could be in danger if she's not surrounded by a cohort of bodyguards. I think that there are sources that mention that elite women would either travel with male peers of, male persons of similar status, so senators, for example, or they have enough male servants to protect them. But that's why the traveling alone is, that's why I said like the servants are invisible. I don't know if this really answers your question. I don't remember the exact sources where they're explicitly said to be in male company. But, yeah.
And you have something to add?
Yeah, I think people hardly ever traveled alone for the reasons you pointed out. In case of elites, there was this entire retinue that followed them, but when you look at the papyri in Egypt, for instance, which were often written by people with less financial means, you see sometimes advice given to someone: if you travel, make sure that you get that boat because I know that person. So there is this infrastructure and connections, travel infrastructure and connections that people use to be as safe as possible. So I don't think that men as well as women hardly ever traveled alone, because that was dangerous. And it's in women's case, it certainly, I have the feeling that it not prohibits, that it did not make that women did not travel because it was dangerous, only that they made sure that they used this infrastructure.
Elisa?
Yeah, just a quick addition. So I agree about this travel with retinues, but then also in the travel narratives, we do get sometimes occasional glimpses of possible anxiety related to the travel, which might point to vulnerability. So, for instance, in Genesis, Rachel steals her father's teraphim, some kind of household gods, before the trip, and that gives the impression, the text doesn't explain it, but it gives the impression to the reader that she wants to have protection on the way and needs these material objects with her on the way to a new homeland, where she's forced to move with her husband. And then also, for instance, in the book of Tobit, we have Sarah who has to move because of a marriage arrangement that is made on behalf of her. And then when the time of departure comes, there are these extended scenes of farewell where the parents deliver instruction to her and provide blessings to the traveler. And I think all these, tell about the kind of emotional toll of movement and the vulnerability of people at moments of transition.
Well, unfortunately, we are approaching the end of this session. I would have loved to continue to learn more from you, but we have to move on. I would like that we all join in thanking you for this wonderful session. And I leave the word finally to Bjørn Bertelsen.
Thank you for that, Jorunn. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I'm the academic director of the Holberg Prize. And following today's seminar has been truly inspiring. I also have to say that quite a great variety of perspectives on gendered forms of mobility have come to the fore through this focus on women's travels. Crucially, we have learned that gender, mobility, and power are entwined in ways that allow us better to understand the past as well as the present. And being an anthropologist, I also have, of course, a lot of questions that I could have asked about temporality, space, and cosmology. But rest assured, I will leave that aside because you have all summarized the points very, very nicely. I will, however, want to thank all those that have participated here and who have made this into such a rewarding event. This includes Lien Faubert, Jessica van Weisteind, and Truls Myrup Christensen. They all gave highly interesting responses to the question of what enabled or compelled women to travel in the past. So thank you. I would also like to thank Professor Jorunn Økland, who has steered us through the seminar in such an inspired and energetic way. Last but not least, I thank Nils Klim Laureate Elisa Uusimäki for providing us all with this thought-provoking topic, and today also sharing some of her insights into these matters. Thank you also to the audience for having attended, and I think that also calls for another applause. Now, I would also like to add that this event, the Nils Klim Seminar, is just the first in a full, packed Holberg week with spectacular events. So after lunch, which is served at the back of this room, please consider yourself invited to all these upcoming events. This includes the masterclass with Holberg Prize laureate Sheila Jarsanov in Media City Bergen at 1 o'clock today. If you're interested in joining this event, a volunteer will take you to the venue at 12:40. We will make sure this is duly announced before leaving. So welcome again to the rest of the Holberg week also. Thank you.